Hey, hello guys. Hello everybody. I hope you can have the opportunity to watch us through YouTube channel, my personal channel, Obed Frausto Gatica. Today, the reason why we have this encounter with Charlie Geyer is the presentation of my whole book, Tres Tradiciones en la Teoría de la Legitimidad Política, which I translate like the three traditions in the political legitimacy theory. Was published by Terra Ignota, a publisher in Barcelona, Spain. And well, the reason here is to discuss and to have a conversation about the main ideas, the main thoughts, the main concepts that was displayed in my book. So I will introduce Charlie Geyer. He's assistant professor at Ball State University in Indiana. He's my colleague. I'm professor as well at Ball State University. He has a PhD in Vanderbilt University in Portuguese and Spanish. So I'm going to provide the time, Charlie Geyer, for us to explain what do you think about the main ideas and the main points of my book. Thank you so much for the invitation, Charlie.
I love it. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you about your book, Obed. It was really a pleasure to read and very interesting. So I have a couple of sort of notes prepared about general reactions to the book and sort of the questions and extended reflections that the book provoked in me. I suppose to start, I'll just kind of go through the structure of the book as it appeared to me, to sort of give any viewers who are unfamiliar with it a general idea. First off, I thought the structure was really fascinating and really easy to follow. Essentially, within in the first chapter, you sort of do a great job giving a general idea of what these three traditions of theories of political legitimacy are, how they sort of spring from Max Weber's conception of the three different spheres of social life, and how they are related to this concept of the jornada de despliegue, which is a term obviously in Spanish that I'm not sure I can do justice to in translation, but this sort of idea that human thought is rooted in social process, and our ways of sort of knowing and understanding and thinking about the world and about society are in sort of this continual process of transformation that is certainly not unidirectional nor teleological, but sort of goes in a general trajectory from mythos to logos to ratio. And I guess just to start with, before getting into the more general structure about the three points of or the three traditions of political legitimacy, I'd love to hear you speak a little bit more about the jornada de despliegue. This seems like an original contribution and conception on your part. If so, I'd love to sort of hear like how it came into being, what sort of, if it's sort of rooted in or in dialogue with or in parallel with sort of other traditions of thinking about human thought and how it grows and evolves. And just to hear a little more about the jornada de despliegue, because it seems to be a key concept for talking about these three traditions of legitimacy.
Sure, Charlie. Thank you. Thank you so much. You're right. Definitely, this concept is the key concept in the book. Actually, we decided to translate like batch unfolding, right? Batch has this meaning about cookies or bread that are baking, so it's a little bit understanding that process, the process in which I understood that process. I used the conception of rationality. Max Weber inspired so much to me in this view, in this perspective. So as I mentioned in the introduction of the book, Max Weber used the concept of social rationality. So he's conceptualizing the notion of reason by Immanuel Kant, the critique of the pure reason, but Immanuel Kant just described this process in the cognitive dimension and the human way of thinking. But Max Weber used this concept to understand the social processes of transformation, specifically in Europe through Protestantism and definitely expanded by the Industrial Revolution. So he used the concept of rationality, social rationality. So when I was thinking about this, my difference with Max Weber here, for example, I think I use the conception of tradition. So Max Weber is using the concept of tradition as one specific definition of typology of political legitimacy. He talks about three conceptions of legitimacy: the traditional legitimacy, charismatic legitimacy, and bureaucratic legitimacy. So he used the concept of tradition in one of these typologies, but he thinks about the concept of tradition as something not reflective, something even irrational, as a irrational process where society or social communities don't produce reflexivity in that process, and they only following some moral rules, some moral norms, or something like that. So, but I'm using the conception of tradition as something different that Max Weber is using here. The concept of tradition I'm using here probably is inspired by Gadamer. Gadamer has a concept of tradition in which he kind of believed that tradition is a process of reflection and rationality, and he's using concepts and ideas and thoughts through an hermeneutical process, a process of understanding the perspective of the other, the point of view of the other. So I using this conception of tradition historically as well. McIntyre, Alistair McIntyre, is having this understanding about the process of transformation, of thinking through traditions where there is discussions and debates and controversies, that in those controversies, new thoughts and new ideas emerge and are produced, but also those controversies imply and reinforce the point of view of each other. So in that case, I'm using the conception of tradition historically, right? So Max Weber is using probably a sociological conception of legitimacy, and I'm using this historical conception of legitimacy by the concept of tradition. But something that I would like to add here is like, in the beginning, because I wrote this book, I started to write in this book when in my bachelor's dissertation, almost 10 years ago, or even more. And in that one, I used the batch, a rational batch, or probably a batch unfolding rationalization. But I decided to put away that concept of rationality because I think there's more elements there that we need to include, like passions, feelings, affections, creativity, imagination. Because I'm using the conceptions of the sphere of Max Weber here. Max Weber explained this process of social rationalization through spheres. So he kind of believed, like in the beginning of society, they were only one sphere, and then eventually through the transformation or the evolution or the unfolding of society, process of rationality starting to separate spheres. And he saw three different main spheres, which is the cognitive sphere, the normative sphere, and the creative sphere. Three spheres that are so similar to the three critiques of Immanuel Kant: the critique of pure reason, the critique of normative action, and the critique of the judgment. So these three spheres, but Max Weber kind of visualized it in the social element. So I use this the concept of the batch unfolding, similar to the conception of bread, or what is happening with the bread of the cookie when it's put on baking, because sometimes you don't know how there's like so much complexity in the development of the bread, of the increasing of the bread that is going uh, up. So it's really hard to tell when a jump or jumping and the bread is going to happen. So I use it like a similar something like that. The development is not linear. It's kind of uh, paradoxical, sometimes is complex in complexity, but also with the unfolding batch, I'm trying to say that sometimes there's some moments of back and forward, like sometimes you go, some elements, they are not developed like a cycle. Sometimes the cycle is going back uh, and then eventually is like a new impulse to create something new for the future. So in the way that I saw it now, it's like a different process of cycles that eventually is moving forward. But in different cycles, you can see some moments of backwards, like the development is going back and then eventually it's moving forward again. So basically, that's a little bit the conceptualization of this jornadas de despliegue that we would translate it like on batch unfolding, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a fascinating concept, and I wonder. I mean, do you see it as having any sort of parallel with Foucault's concept of the episteme? Because it seems like there's a similarity in the sense that when we think about, as you explain, this sort of progression from a sort of human society based in mythos versus logos versus ratio, which would be the rationalization of modernity. First off, in this sort of back and forth process, it seems like you allow for the possibility of, like, whereas there's sort of a general trajectory of human thinking, these things can also mythos, logos, and ratio can also exist simultaneously within a given society, and it's sort of a question of predominance. But yeah, do you see any parallels with Foucault there, or any significant differentiations?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a great question. Yeah, I don't see similarities. I can see where probably those ideas can match with the conception of Michel Foucault. Definitely, the conception of Michel Foucault is historical. Probably in that way, my view, my structure, or my conceptualization of the tradition of legitimacy probably similar in that way, historical. Probably because of my influence of Max Weber, because at the end I discovered that even though I was a little bit suspicious, and probably I explained in the introduction that my view has been changed, and I don't feel that connection anymore with Max Weber. I think I try to respect what was the younger Obed explained in that book. So I keep it up. I keep and maintain mostly the structure and this Beberian rationalization. But I think in that way it's a little bit different for the conception of Michel Foucault. Basically because Michel Foucault is more inspired in Nietzsche, and I think the inspiration of Max Weber is in Kant. So you have two different narratives there, right? Immanuel Kant probably is the base, the foundation of society. Knowledge is definitely rationality, this form of reflexivity, this capacity of the cognitivity in terms of producing rational concepts and a rational logic that somehow is related with a form of science based and inspired in this Newtonian science, transformative form of science. And I think Nietzsche is basically questioning and criticizing the culture there. Definitely for Nietzsche, probably the source, the origins of knowledge probably can be the frictions and the contradictions of emotions, frictions. And probably in this case, Nietzsche see the foundation as power, right? Like power is always produced there. And I think in my elaboration, Foucault, of course, is inspiring that conception of genealogy, and then he's using this methodology, but also is making that connection between power and knowledge. For that reason, he's talking about the microphysics, or he's talking about, dispositive of power through the history of sexuality, producing biopolitics or so. But I think in my case, because I'm still really Weberian, or Max Weber inspired my reflection, I still think, or at least in this book, is displayed in this idea, or probably in this belief that power and knowledge a little bit is separated, I mean, of course, we are trying to understand something related with power, which is legitimacy, but I'm using probably rationality, or I'm using knowledge as a foundation to kind of understand the classification, the types of typologies of power, but based in knowledge and based in rationality. But I think Foucault is doing the opposite. I think Foucault is putting power in the source, power in the bottom, and then from power is kind of displaying these forms of knowledge, or these forms of types of knowledge and typology that he's using here to explain the current society. But I think I see those differences. I can see a little bit of Michel Foucault in the historical perspective, but definitely it's a different project. It is a different project. Right now, actually, I'm working in a book on biopolitics and necropolitics. The other element here, I think, is Michel Foucault is questioning the conception of legitimacy as a sovereignty, of the theory of sovereignty, right? Probably Michel Foucault would question from the foundation my book, because he kind of believed, like in modern societies, this form of power, the sovereign power of sovereignty, doesn't apply anymore in our society. But contrary to Foucault, I'm kind of thinking that the theory of sovereignty is still useful and maybe apply to different aspects in our society. So probably that's another element that we have we have a difference. I have a difference with Michel Foucault. And probably the other one here is, like, definitely Michel Foucault is putting away the conception of power, of domination in this logic of Max Weber. And then he's introducing the conception of life and the conception of death. And I think this is a really interesting move. And definitely in this book, there's no any mention to that conception, life and death. And just keep it up in this distinction between power and domination, and trying to understand the theory of legitimacy based on the conception and the theory of sovereignty in the confirmation of the state, and the legal power of legal domination. And I think Michel Foucault doesn't have that perspective, that reading from the conception of power. So probably that's another difference that I have from Michel Foucault in this book.
You very eloquently put your work in dialogue with Foucault there, and responded to sort of a number of just sort of provocative thoughts and reflections that I had in reading, especially related to sovereignty and the crisis of legitimacy as it relates to sovereignty, as you mentioned in your introduction, a book that you recently edited, that was recently published, and I'll also congratulate you for that as well, about the weariness of democracy, and this point at which nation state sovereignty begins to be eroded by the power of capital and corporate entities. And so that gets to some questions that I have perhaps later on about this crisis of legitimacy and what your book can tell us. And I think it can tell us many things about how we can respond to this crisis of legitimacy when the seat of power is shifting, even within a theory of sovereignty, as sort of being an operative theoretical basis. And I think your trilogical and perhaps quadrilogical conceptions of political legitimacy, and the last one being something you only reference in the conclusion as an area for further study, can be really interesting ways of addressing that issue. But before moving on to those concerns, Now that we've talked a little bit about the jornada de despliegue, in my reading anyways, you sort of use this concept to describe a general trajectory, and certainly not a linear one, but a teleodynamic one is the word that I believe that you use, of sort of how human thinking evolves and the effect that has on Weber's three spheres and on society, and how different traditions of thinking about political legitimacy evolve from there. And this historical element of your conception of the jornada de despliegue allows you to really trace a genealogy of these three traditions, or at least in a sense, a historical projection, or progression of these three traditions, going from classical antiquity with Plato and Aristotle and even Jesus Christ and Ruth of Nazareth, to various figures in the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, and then into early modernity and modernity, and even perhaps getting into post-modernity, especially with Dussel. So I thought that was all really well done, and that structure made a lot of sense. And in doing so, you sort of locate different thinkers within these three different traditions. So chapter 1 is sort of talking about from Plato to Aristotle, touching Thomas Aquinas and Machiavelli as well. Chapter 2, a very interesting read on Weber, who I'm really not familiar with as a sort of specialist in literature and cultural studies. That was a new and very interesting reading for me. And then sort of locating different modern thinkers within these three spheres. Carl Schmitt being in a monological sphere, in which legitimacy is essentially, and so these, just for any viewers who are unfamiliar, I'll gloss quickly your conception. This monological tradition of political legitimacy being one in which essentially the sovereign dictates power to the governed. In other words, legitimacy is based on the sovereign, and the governed acquiesce to the power of the sovereign. A dialogical tradition in which the focus is on intersubjectivity and understanding amongst the governed, which exist in a dialogical relationship with the sovereign and power, and legitimacy is constructed in this more dialogical way. And then the trilogical tradition having this sort of third element of integrating those that are outside of the political process in meaningful ways, whether as not citizens, those who are immigrants, who live outside the nation state, as well as those who are internally in meaningful ways excluded from the political process based on race, sexuality, political orientation, et cetera, class certainly as well. And so yeah, locating Schmitt in the monological tradition, Hannah Arendt in the dialogical tradition, and Jose Maria Vigil, a Mexican philosopher, in the trilogical tradition. And then in your final chapter, putting three more thinkers into locating them within these sort of traditions and genealogies of political legitimacy. Habermas being in a dialogical tradition, Luhmann being monological, and Dussel being in the trilogical tradition. So I wanted to talk about Hannah Arendt for a minute, because sort of thinking about her and your explanation of and locating her within the dialogical tradition was one of the most interesting parts of the book for me, and allowed me to sort of think about the ways in which the boundaries between perhaps the dialogical tradition and the trilogical tradition can start to get a little blurred, and not in like in a negative way, or as though we're a weakness of the sort of theorization, but rather as sort of a consequence of the ways that we think about politics. And so Arendt, being located in the dialogical tradition, this sort of intersubjective consensus building, and please, by the way, in your response, correct any sort of, if you feel like I'm giving any misrepresentations of this sort of summary of your structure and your thinking. It was interesting that she was in the dialogical tradition, and I can completely understand why, because it seems that the clearest distinction between a dialogical and a trilogical tradition is this explicit emphasis or impulse in looking outwards to that radical difference that is not a part of the dialogical conversation. and Arendt not having that explicit focus or impulse so much in sort of her ways of thinking about political legitimacy. So on one hand, I understand that distinction, but on the other hand, her position as refugee was fascinating to me. And also the ways in which you talk about her creativity. I think it's on page 117 in your book. The ways in which she thinks about politics. Para Arendt, la política es una forma de hacer arte. And the ways that you think about creativity as being associated with this third sphere of aesthetics or expressiveness, which is associated with the triological sphere. So my point here is not to challenge sort of your distinction and putting her in within the dialogical sphere, but to think about really the ways in which a sort of dialogical conception of political legitimacy is always going to be fraught, because in a sense, it may always be eliding those who are not meaningfully participating in the political conversation, in this dialogical conversation. And then thinking about sort of the triological tradition, my question becomes then, is the purpose then to more meaningfully include those who are outside of this dialogical conversation, in essence, sort of turning a triological structure into a dialogical one through inclusion? So in other words, is the dialogical tradition always sort of opening to the triological through its sort of failures to integrate or to include? Integrate, probably not the best word. In the triological tradition, sort of looking back to the dialogical one and trying to realize a truly dialogical conversation between all of those excluded? Or is the triological tradition, in essence, trying to do something more radical? In other words, always sort of always sort of remaining open to that which is outside, to that which is different. And in essence, sort of blurring the border between the nation state, what's inside and outside, the Bali politic, what's inside and outside. And it made me think of Derrida's conception of radical hospitality, of this sense in which, if I'm remembering correctly, it's been a while since I've read it, but this sense in which sort of inviting an other in an act of hospitality is always to like assert a difference, in which it becomes sort of an act of hostility as well as hospitality, and sort of play between those two things. And the radical hospitality is just always remaining open for the possibility of arrival without expecting it. And would that be the sort of true impulse of the triological tradition? So I know that was a lot, but whatever thoughts or reactions you have to that sort of blurring of borders between dialogical and triological, I would be very interested in.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for your comments and actually your question. Actually, you're right. When I was reading that, specifically that section, I was thinking about it and say, oh, that's interesting. It says like Hannah Arendt, probably I can move from this dialogical tradition through to the triological tradition. So I just wanted to explain a little bit what is behind this distinction, the monological, dialogical, and triological political legitimacy. Of course, in that way, I'm also inspiring Max Weber. So Max Weber is using this typology as an heuristic perspective. What does that mean? It means like it's a construction, it's an elaboration, and of course, in some ways, arbitrary, right? So probably I'm taking some elements, some characteristics of some of the authors, and then I decided to put it in one of these categories, right? But actually, the reason I decided to put Hannah Arendt in the dialogical legitimacy tradition was because she has this emphasis in the dialogue and the consensus. Of course, in that one, it is interesting because she's inviting us to think about the classical and the ancient Greek, the conception of this ancient conception of politics by Aristotle and Plato. Of course, she's a little bit critical against this essentialism of the conception of politics in Aristotle and Plato. And she kind of believed like the politics is always in the between. So this area is a relational conception, right? Where the most important element here is the language, the dialogue, understanding, understanding about the different points of view and understandings that we have a plurality and diversity of perspectives in the public spheres. So in that way, I put the emphasis in this conception of this dialect, the dialogical conception of power. Because of that one, I think I can see that she has an emphasis, a really important emphasis in the dialogue, in the consensus. Over here, definitely, she's talking about the bond sense, the common sense here is a really important element here to establish some agreements. So in that way, I think this is why I decided to put it there. Definitely, you're right. There's some elements of creativity. Sometimes she's using the aesthetical or the arts, or most specifically the Kant's critique of the judgment, that there's more emphasis in this form of creativity, this form of transformation that definitely is providing some elements here in connection with freedom, a form of freedom that is more communitative, or it is a collective conception of freedom rather than this individual conception of freedom, in which that freedom is connected with a form of a miracle, that definitely that miracle is a form of a creation, something creativity, something that is not behind, or there is not before this potential, this horizon to transform society. But there's some elements here. So what's going on here? Why I decided not to put it in the triological element? There's some critiques aspects of Hannah Arendt. The idea here is like she's emphasizing the conception of freedom by the ancient Greeks. Some people actually believe that bringing this conception of freedom, sometimes implicitly, she brings she brings implicitly or accepting implicitly the slavery in the ancient times, right? Because at the end, the conception of freedom from the Greeks and the ancient Greeks was mostly the people who were owners of property, or owners of slavers or slaves. So some people actually believe and is questioning this conception of freedom that is matching with the ancient Greeks, when basically she's not questioning and criticizing explicitly that element in that conception of freedom as a miracle, based in the conception of going beyond the oikos, which is this domestic, the household dominion. So the freedom is going beyond that. And I understand this conception in terms of, yeah, definitely we have to have an emphasis on freedom rather than necessity. And definitely the modern society has been providing an emphasis in the necessity in terms of the state, or the power of the sovereignty power of the state is one of the most important focus here, is to keep it up, the household, the necessity, the order in that element, rather than explicitly emphasize the power in the liberties and the freedom, right? That's one of the most elements critiques, probably from Habermas in this case. But the other element here probably is like Jose Maria Vigil, for example, is providing a conception of power in which the most important element here is emancipation. Definitely Hannah Arendt probably talks about that, but definitely something that probably is missing there is like this emphasizing the element of emancipation, transformation, probably revolution that Jose Maria Vigil probably is providing here. The element why I put in there the theological element here is like probably Jose Maria Vigil is definitely discussing the element of mestizaje. You know, that's a big thing here in Latin America and different cultures. The idea here of what we're going to do with the indigenous and the Europeans, and of course in this coalition, or this clash of different cultures, or in this exchange of different cultures through the conquest and the process of colonizations for centuries in Latin America. So Jose Maria Vigil is kind of understanding that process historically, and definitely from this indigenous perspective, definitely he has seen someone that is excluded, someone that is probably far away from the consensus that is inside of the society. So in some way, I think he kind of describe, or he kind of oversee that the conception of the otherness, that probably in Hannah Arendt I don't see it so strongly. But I don't know. But at least, but I want to say that Hannah Arendt, I read some of the key books for example, the definition of politics, and probably I'm using those as an element to describe her position here, because I know that she's a refugee. I know that she's criticizing the totalitarianism of the state because of the final solution in the Nazi state and all that stuff. And definitely her view is coming from this refugee, and her view is from an outsider, and the conception of the otherness inside of Europe. Something that is interesting with Jose Maria Vigil is like he described the otherness and this the other, but someone that is probably excluded from the view and this perspective. And definitely, I think here I'm thinking more in this the colonial turn. This is why probably I match it with Enrique Dussel, where the other it's someone that from the beginning has been excluded. I mean, of course, I don't want to say which one is more excluded, if the Jews or the indigenous population. I think they have similar elements. But I don't know. Of course, there's like a big discussion there. I don't know. I'm not saying this stuff in the book, but there's some justifications, or there's more elaborations there. For example, Sartre has a really interesting exchange and discussion with Frantz Fanon. Specifically, Sartre was talking about the otherness, the Jews, right? And Frantz Fanon was questioning a little bit their view of Sartre, the view of Sartre's conception of the others by the Jews. One of the most interesting elements here is Frantz Fanon was saying something like the Jews can be converted in the modern society, right? Because of this color of the skin, or something like that. Frantz Fanon was so critical about it and say something like the other from the colonies, they have like this kind of racial distinction, and for them it would be impossible to be assimilated in the culture. There's always this element of distinction, and this making the element of inequality, the inequality that is expressed in that form of socialization. Frantz Fanon definitely is talking about the African American in the colonies, in the American continent. And here, Jose Maria Vigil definitely is not talking about that. I think I find out some connections with that. I think he's trying to explain the conception of mestizaje, but he always critical about this form of assimilation, of unification of the races. And for that reason, I think his cosmopolitan perspective is pluralistic in that way. And at least in the theory or in the conception of power or the conception of politics of Hannah Arendt, there is not an explicit element here about those distinctions of race, distinctions of social class, gender, sexuality, and ethnicity. So I think there's more emphasis in that one with Jose Maria Vigil when he's talking about the concept like mestizaje, right? He kind of believed that the process of mestizaje is always in contradiction, and those forms of contradiction may have some forms of relations of power and power. And I think I like that view, and I think it's more elaborated definitely with Enrique Dussel in the last chapter, when I make the distinction where definitely he's talking about the excluded. He's talking about is mostly excluded from Latin America, from the global South, where basically it's more easy to see that the immigrants or the foreigners in this specific connection with the decolonial theory, or the concept of transmodernity that he's kind of proposing in terms of, definitely it's a normative, axiological normative conception, where it's necessary to have more a transformative element, a materialistic element here. But definitely, this is a little bit why probably I would still to keep it off Hannah Arendt in this dialogical legitimacy tradition. But I don't know. Thank you so much for your question and and your insightful uh, uh, comment and
Well,
perspective.
thank you for that explication, and it certainly makes a lot of sense. And I guess I'm curious as to so I wonder if the trialogical tradition, in some sense, can be thought of as like as a critique of a dialogical tradition. In other words, a critique of sort of the chimera of actual meaningful political dialogue within a body politic, which is this presupposition of like equality between citizens to arrive to a consensus in a dialogical way. And then what its sort of vision for, if not resolving that problematic, is sort of elaborating it fully. In the sense, is it an ideal to sort of bring that which is outside in to form a new body, a more inclusive body, to arrive at sort of like dialogical consensus building and constructing legitimacy in this way? Or is it something in which case it would seem that the sort of dialogical tradition and the trilogical tradition are always sort of opening to each other in a way that's interesting? Or is it something even more radical than that, in which like the question of the border of body politic is always in question and always open to that third outside, which could be anything, not even necessarily a citizen of another country, not necessarily an immigrant, not necessarily a person from a marginalized racial group or a marginalized sexual group or a marginalized class group. It could literally be anything, and maintaining this radical openness of the political body. I find this idea fascinating, and in my reading sort of found it a really provocative question that was at least provoked for me. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or any resolution of that, or yeah.
Oh yeah, no, that's a great comment. Actually, something that I was thinking after finishing my book with the dialogue and the discussion with other colleagues is like suddenly I realized that probably was missing something like probably the disagreement to understand, one of these spheres in the political legitimacy environment. Normally, and probably they were right. I mean, we were having this discussion, and there's probably so much emphasis in the conception of consensus and an agreement, right? Definitely, there's some French philosophers today, specifically Jacques Rancière, who's probably questioning that idea of the consensus, that probably political philosophy has been failing us in that way because he's, like there's always the tradition thinking that the most important element is the agreement and the consensus. And rather he kind of believed that we have to have emphasizing in the disagreement. And probably they were right. I mean, probably one of the critiques of my book, like this dialogical element is based on the agreement. But something that is, now that I'm thinking about it and this dialogue I'm having with you, in this element with the theological element, inviting the other, the excluded, someone that is outside of this consensus, probably is implicitly inviting the disagreement, inviting the potential disruption of the consensus, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, in this way, this is something interesting because normally what I define as this first sphere of this third typology of the theological political legitimacy was the element of creation that is connected with a form of emancipation. And I think it is in that way. I think that theological sphere, this theological conception of legitimacy probably is putting a mark question in the consensus, in the conception of the common sense and the bond sense, or specifically how they define what is a good politics in a territory based, of course, in a state of law, based, of course, in some forms of institution implemented by the state, right? But this state, of course, is founded mostly in this form of monocultural view. I think with this theological element, the theological political legitimacy definitely is questioning this form of monological culture that is emphasized and probably is imposed in some of those territories, in these national states territories. And of course, is inviting us to think about like probably this is where the real plurality is there, right? The real plurality today for our modern society, in the fact that what probably one of the big discussions today is probably what we should do with the refugees. Definitely something that is in the agenda of the national states today is what about the immigrants? And I think it is becoming a really important subject here. And the fact that the immigrants and the refugees and most of the others don't have those political rights or these social rights, probably something that we should think about it, that this is something that we should think about it, and probably we should provide a resolution about it, and definitely I'm questioning here this idea, the conception of the national state is like, oh, because I born here, I have more rights than any other person here. So probably this theological political legitimacy concept can help me to probably challenge those narratives and emphasizing that the real other or the real foreigner in this political uh, community is definitely someone that is an outsider from that specific community or that specific society, where probably the idea of the disagreement, uh, it's implicit, and where definitely we have to go beyond the rational elements here, probably in the dimension of the aesthetic, the creativity. And you have been working a little bit more in that one. This is mostly uh, your expertise, your something that you have been working in that one, and definitely is making that connection. But I don't know. Thank you so much for that question. Was a great question.
Well, yeah, and to be clear, I don't think the question indicates any sort of like absence or weakness on the book. I think it speaks to a political reality. And I'm so glad that you brought up Rancière, because really my next question, and perhaps you tell me when we're good on time, but one of the pressing questions that I had was this question of like, what is the role of art and the relationship between art and emancipation? And thinking about the trilogical tradition as I think you just said very beautifully, is perhaps being like predicated on continual dissensus. I think you said like disagreement is implicit in a trilogical tradition. In other words, it wouldn't be the sort of ideal goal wouldn't be forming a new sort of uniform common sense, but sort of like welcoming that disruption of difference and dissensus. And so, yeah, I wonder if you have any thoughts on the role of art in sort of imagining and sort of creating within an artistic discourse that can then, at least theoretically, open into a more broad discourse, a political discourse what is the role of art in sort of like creating these imaginaries of like constant openness to dissensus. And I think this for me comes to, and again, this is sort of in line with my own research interest, this question of border, and what is our border of nation state and what is our border of body politic. At what point is it continually opening to this dissensus, to this difference, to this disagreement, and ultimately, like, how does that show up in art? And how does art contribute it to a sort of politics of dissensus, and how is it linked to this emancipation? These are key questions that your book really was getting at and opening up for me. And so, yeah, any further thoughts or comments you have on that, I would love to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the question. Yeah. I don't know. I think it has to be a little bit with the conception of utopia. I mean, of course, I didn't bring that concept here in my book, but I right now I'm doing a collected book in French, And actually, the topic of the book is utopia and dystopia in the political imagination. In that one, we have been exploring a little bit that link, that connection, in the way that I perceive it, because I definitely I mean, probably I'm an expert. I haven't explored so much about the arts and the aesthetic dimension in politics, but I connected a little bit with the conception of imagination, or probably with this conception of utopia, where probably in that one, for example, some other philosophers, some other thinkers in the 19th century, for example, Pierre Leroux, which was a French, the first uh, thinker who proposed the idea of socialism. Uh, in the 20th century, uh, Miguel Abençur is probably one of the most important thinkers. But of course, the connection there, of course, is Walter Benjamin, Ernst Bloch. You know, they're talking about like how, as human beings, we are utopian beings. You know, like we have the tendency to create, to imagine, to produce a new types of societies, right? And that's a little bit those capacities that we make. The way probably there is, I see it in two ways, right? From the phenomenology, it's called the epoche. The epoche is always putting something in parentheses, and putting in parentheses like it's a form of waking up. It's a form of questioning the reality that we are living. It's a form of finally finish our sleeping or our dream, and then eventually that form of epoche may produce, like this, the awakening. That's a really important moment. And the second moment definitely is inspired by Walter Benjamin. He kind of talks about the imagination, this dialectical conception in which he kind of oversee the constellations of possibilities that we can see, and finally you are capable to connect elements that are unconnected. You can kind of move forward the borders, the frontiers. And I think the arts probably is one of the best ways to do those kind of stuff, right? Because in arts there is no limits. Normally in forms of science, the concepts, the rationality, sometimes it has some really strong rules, and nobody has to go beyond those rules on rationality. But I think the arts may have more capacity to play a little bit with more of the elements, and breaking the borders and breaking rules in that way. And probably it's a form of potential imagination, where finally we have this form of awakening through the phenomenological epoche. And also we can see this Walter Benjamin conception of the constellation, right, where the horizons can be perceived, the plurality of horizons can be perceived at the same time. Well, I don't know, that's probably what I can respond about that question. Yeah.
Well, I agree. I very much agree. And yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book. Truly, show it again here for any viewers who are still with us now. It was a very provocative and fruitful read for me, and I enjoyed. Yeah, I appreciate the invite to have a conversation with you about it.
No, thank you, Charlie. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your comments and your questions. And has been a really a pleasant conversation with you. And see you later. And probably we're going to have more conversations like that potential in the future. So, but anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you.